So I've had some pretty epic campsites over the years backpacking, and that's what this video is all about, is my favorite backpacking campsites I've ever had. We're actually going to talk about my least favorite backpacking campsites also, what I look for when choosing a campsite, so there might be some tips in this that will help you pick a good site, and what I try to avoid when choosing a site. So I'm going to start right into one of my favorite campsites ever. I'm going to go a little bit in depth of why these sites are so memorable to me. So the first site I have to mention is a site that I stayed at Dolly Sods. Now, Dolly Sods has established campsites all over the place. Before I ever went to Dolly Sods, I watched a lot of videos on it, and I really just had this picture in my head of what I wanted from a campsite, which was I wanted to be on top of one of the hills with like a nice view, which 9 times out of 10, that is what I look for the most in a campsite. I know a lot of people kind of avoid the up high exposed campsites because of wind and weather and other things, but that is what my favorite quality of a campsite is. So the first time I went to Dolly Sods with my wife, we actually stayed on top of this bald, and we passed up a good campsite down by the river, and we filtered up a bunch of water, and there's a bunch of people down there, and although it was a pretty good campsite, there was tons of little campsites all over the place, so we could have found somewhere good right by water, but I really just had that idea in my head that I wanted a view. So we just kept hiking on, and it didn't take much longer till we just spotted kind of an open bald hill to the left of the trail. And this was, as far as we knew, not established at all, but I just had this thought in my head that I wanted to be up high. So I dropped the pack and ran up to the top of this hill, kind of hoping to find somewhere that was able to be used as a campsite, not necessarily looking for an established site, but I actually stumbled across a little area where there was a fire pit somebody had made. It was a doable campsite. It was no means like a perfect campsite. It was a little bit overgrown. I remember searching around, even though it was flat, it was really rocky, and we set up our tent in probably like the only area where there weren't going to be like rocks sticking in our back. So we really got lucky there. By no means the perfect campsite, but it was one of my favorites, because I think number one being that it was the first time I had backpacked with like an open like vista, like mountain views and whatnot. Like it was the first time I'd ever got a site that wasn't down in the dark woods, which was amazing. We got a really, really cool pink sky at night. We got to see like a storm moving in the distance, and the stars up there were absolutely unbelievable. To this day, we've never seen a night sky so dark and so many stars out. It was so memorable. It was amazing. But camping up high has its disadvantages for a lot of people. Most people I found prefer to try to find a campsite near water. When you're planning a trail logistically, it just makes sense to camp by water because, you know, if you're making coffee, rehydrating your food, you kind of want that endless supply of water to be able to eat and drink as much as you want. But like I said, one of my favorite things about a campsite is having a good view. If I'm nearing the end of a day and I'm getting to an area where I think I'm going to be camping up high, I will always try to fill my water to full capacity so I have plenty for the night to get me through the morning. Another one of my favorite sites is the very first site that I stayed on, night one, when I was on the Timberline Trail in Oregon. Now this site was very small, but it had a few qualities that I liked. One of it being very, very established. So it's pretty much like really padded down dirt, almost sand. I like to get to camp and throw on some flip-flops and walk around and not really want to worry about ticks and bugs. I don't know if they even have ticks out there, but it's nice having a nice clear area. The first place that I mentioned in Dolly Sods, it was a lot of overgrown grass, so not really ideal, it not being a really established campsite. This one had definitely had a lot of use over the years. It was a smaller campsite, but it fit me perfect. If there was another person in my group, or if there was one other tent with me, we would have been crammed in the site, but for a one person, one tent setup, it was really nice. It was also right by a little creek, like within 10 feet of a creek. I really don't even know if it was a legal site. I'm not sure if there's rules out there that you have to camp so far away from water or off of the trail, but it was established, and it was the first night, so it was already getting late because I started late, and so I was setting up there no matter what. Also, the site was right on the trail, which wasn't a problem at all because when I stopped, it was already later on the evening, not one person passed. But if I would have set up early on in the day, I don't like a bunch of people walking through my campsite. So I always try to find a campsite that is off of the trail a good ways at least. That site also had an amazing view of Mount Hood. I already said it, but I mean, view is like the number one thing I look for. So my family and I, we always like to go down to the Smoky Mountains and rent a cabin. And there's a few things I look for when looking for a cabin, and that's kind of like a campsite. Like, you want good feng shui, you want a good mountain view, you kind of want some space, like a big 8-frame setup is nice, and a hot tub on the porch. So that's really similar to a campsite other than the hot tub. So this site on the Timberline Trail just had a good vibe. The last site I'm going to mention is actually the first campsite that I stayed on when I was in the Three Sisters Wilderness in Oregon, and that was, I can't remember. I'll throw up the B-roll here. I think it might have been Site 18. I could be wrong. At the Green Lakes area in the Three Sisters Wilderness. Now, the campsite itself wasn't ideal, but the general area where I was at was amazing. Had a great view of South Sister Mountain, big open area to kind of hang out in the sun. There was 2 different lakes there. I had the smaller one all by myself, just chilling out there. The downside of that site was I had to climb up this really, really steep hill to get to my site. I had a little bit of a view of the mountain through the trees. Even though I was kind of covered by a forest, there was no widowmakers or anything above me, which is something you really also want to consider. It's one of those things that I know about, but I never think about until after I've set up my tent. So anytime you're setting up, you want to look above you, make sure there's no dead branches or anything that are hanging that could potentially kill you in the middle of the night. But once again, having a great view and access to water, just a really, really scenic campsite. That's definitely one of my favorites. So let's go into my number 1 least favorite campsite I've ever had while backpacking, or what to not look for in a backpacking campsite. So that site would be at Lake Vesuvius. It was my very first backpacking trip, so me and a lot of the guys I was with, we really had no idea what we were doing. Our packs were way too heavy. We took way too much time, too many breaks playing around. We actually fished out of the lake a little bit, and we just didn't have a good concept of time during that trip. So when it came time to camp, we weren't finding anything. We just started going up this hill. We weren't even on the backpacking trail anymore. We had got off of it. It was getting dark, basically. So we just had to find flat ground, period, to be able to set up the tent we were going to sleep in. Finally leveled out. We found some flat ground. Completely not ideal campsite. Just like a foot or 2 of overgrowth. So you don't want to sit in the bushes, basically. I mean, we didn't have chairs, there was no logs, there was nothing to sit on, so we're sitting like Indian style on the ground, and with our headlamps looking around, there were just spiders everywhere, which is funny because I kind of assumed that was my first trip ever, so I thought that's kind of how backpacking was. I didn't realize that if you were at a established campsite where it had been trampled over and well used, that, you know, the bugs would be down, but you just go right off of your campsite into the thicket, into the thick brush, and there is so much more insect life. There was no good view, there was no water up there, completely not ideal. I think if I were to mention any other bad campsites, it would probably be other times when I stealth camped or made my own campsite. They're just never as good as an established campsite because you have to make a fire ring. It's always going to be a little bit overgrown. The one good thing, however, is that there's always an abundance of firewood. Established campsites that are really big and really, really heavily used, man, you might search around. You might have to go on a walk for firewood. Wood is sometimes really, really hard to come by. I know at Zaleski State Forest and Mohican State Forest, those are places where I always struggle finding firewood nearby a campsite. I always have to walk like a quarter mile to a half mile down the trail, it feels like, to even find like a good branch to drag back to camp and then process up for wood. So those are just some examples of good and bad campsites. So I'm a tent camper. If you sleep in a hammock, obviously you don't need flat ground, but of all the things to look for, flat ground is number 1 for me, sleeping on the ground. Also, sometimes it might look flat, but you want to check for roots and rocks and whatnot, because if you have one rock that you didn't notice, it will make for a horrible night's sleep, because I've done it before. So make sure your area is flat. I personally love that view. There are disadvantages with being up high, though. Like I said, wind, weather, you're exposed. If you're down in the woods or under some pines, they really shed a lot of the water. No water, though. A lot of times you can luck out out and get something beside water that's not completely down in a valley. I found that the lower you camp, the more damp everything is going to be. Even if it doesn't rain, you might wake up in your tent and everything's going to be totally soaked. So most of the time, I will pass up a campsite that is really, really low elevation down in a creek valley or something, because I just know it's going to be super damp. Also, you don't get that morning sun. When you're up on a hill, you get the morning sun pretty early and it will dry out your stuff if it rained or if anything's a little bit damp. But when you're down in that valley, it might be noon until you even see the sun. So those are just some of the things that I look for when I'm choosing a site. Hopefully some of these can help you. Some things people don't think about are widow makers. You know, you got to think safety. You don't want to set up beside dead standing trees, even if they're not branches hanging. If there's a really, really dead tree beside you, there is a chance that that could fall over and kill you in the middle of the night. So always try to avoid those. I hope this video was helpful to you guys in some way or another. Really, I just kind of wanted to talk about my favorite campsites and what I choose or I look for when choosing a site. So thank you guys again for watching. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and we'll see you on the next one.